Crime drives poverty, not the other way around.
So the city of Chicago has been in the news lately for all the wrong reasons. A few pretty graphic videos have been circulating the internet that have their origin in the Windy City. I will not be showing any of those videos here, but I'm pretty sure you can find them for yourself if you're really that interested. Also, after years of not being profitable due to theft, 4 area Walmarts are shutting down, which surely will be devastating for the local communities. Also in Chicago, for the second time last weekend, a large group of teenagers started rioting. Luckily, no one was killed, though some people suffered gunshot wounds and property was damaged. Now, as you probably know, Chicago recently had a big mayoral election. Cook County Commissioner Brandon Johnson recently beat Chief Executive Officer of Chicago Public Schools, Paul Vallas, in a runoff back in February. Like most major American cities, Chicago basically has no Republican Party presence, so both candidates in the race were Democrats. Despite the fact that they are part of the same party, Vallas was considered the tough-on-crime moderate, and Johnson the progressive. The online left correctly viewed Johnson's victory as a win for their camp.
Long story short, this is a good win. I was concerned that Vallas was going to win, considering how well he did, prior to the runoff.
Now, what was unusual about this most recent election is that Chicago had an incumbent mayor who had sought re-election. Lori Lightfoot assumed office in 2019, but failed to even make the runoff in this most recent election, making her the first incumbent mayor in Chicago not to be re-elected since Jane Byrne in 1983. Now, I would have thought that Lightfoot would have been a shoo-in for re-election after she successfully removed the world's largest toxic dumpster fire from the city limits. I'm of course referring to the Chicago Bears moving to the suburbs. But obviously, the people of Chicago did not feel that way. By most counts, Lightfoot's downfall was crime. As the Washington Post reports, these infractions go beyond garden variety nuisances. Serious gang violence remains a plague. Organized criminal groups have brazenly looted retail stores across the city, including in the main shopping district. Carjackings, muggings, and shootings have become all but routine. Predominantly black neighborhoods have borne the brunt of the chaos. Ominously, a growing number of big businesses, including Boeing Company and Tyson Foods Incorporated, have been fleeing the city. Ken Griffin's Citadel LLC, headquartered in Chicago for decades, pulled out last year after several employees were victimized by crime. There's a general sense out there that the city is in crisis, said Chris Kempczinski, head of McDonald's Corporation, which is also headquartered in Chicago. It's becoming increasingly difficult to operate a global business out of Chicago and Illinois. Now, I loathe the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago. I will literally drive hours out of my way to avoid both of them. But I don't want to see American cities suffer. I would much rather them embrace good governance than continue to languish the way they currently are. Unfortunately, it does not look as though Brandon Johnson will provide that. In 2020, he was a supporter of defund the police.
On multiple occasions, you've spoken on the topic of defunding police. In 2020, you said, quote, defunding this failed system of incarceration and policing was not just admirable, but necessary, end quote. During a town hall called Police Free Future, you commended defund organizers for, quote, an agenda that actually can transform people's lives and said, quote, removing ourselves away from state-sponsored policing. That is commendable. As far as redirecting funds, if we look at your record, you introduced a resolution and passed it with the support of others to redirect money from the sheriff's office to other areas. So first, this is a multi-part question. The first is just a yes or no. Do you acknowledge making those recorded and documented statements, yes or no?
I'm not going to defund the police.
If you could answer the question, though.
Yeah.
Do you acknowledge making the statements that I just read by quote, yes or no?
What I've acknowledged is the fact that there are people who are incredibly frustrated.
Mr. Johnson, if I could get you back to the question,
Yeah, of course.
It's solely yes or no. Do you acknowledge making those statements?
Look, you've
Yes or no?
already quoted. What I'm saying is, though,
So you
is that it
acknowledge making
provides
those
some
statements?
Of course, I'm acknowledging it,
Okay,
but I want to
so
make
I
sure
wanna
that we
give you
have
the
context
opportunity to
to
answer
that.
Our friend Sean over at the channel Actual Justice Warrior has a pretty comprehensive video on him. Sean, of course, is far more knowledgeable on the issues of crime and law enforcement than I am, and he's my go-to source on these issues. One point that he consistently makes on his channel that so many people don't get is that crime causes poverty, not the other way around.
Crime drives poverty, not the other way around. If you have rule of law, if you have protections for private property, if people can invest money, go into business, and potentially make a profit, we have a free market system and people will willingly do that. They will willingly provide goods and services to all kinds of neighborhoods, all kinds of people, as long as they know that their only risk is the risk that is generally associated with going into business. But if you allow criminality to run rampant and nothing about an investment can be secure, insurance rates go up. Potential profits are almost guaranteed to be gobbled up by theft. The government is clearly not on your side, not even prosecuting, so there's no deterrent effect, and there's physical danger for you and your employees to operate in a certain area. You're going to see those businesses flee.
It's not that no one ever robbed a store because they couldn't feed their family. It's that the vast majority of the causation is in the other direction. If people don't feel secure in their property rights, they're unlikely to make investments in that property, and you're not going to get economic development. Rather, you'll see companies leave cities like Chicago for safer areas. You see, the difference between cities, states, and countries that succeed and those that fail are their institutions. That is, the rules, formal and informal, that govern human action within that area. Think of it like an operating system on a computer. Perhaps the most important institution for economic growth is strong property rights. As Darren Acemoglu and James A. Robinson argue in their book, Why Nations Fail, secure property rights and their opposites can have profound economic consequences for a nation in a short period of time. They put forth the Korean Peninsula after the Korean War as an example of this.
It should not surprise us that the economic fortunes of South and North Korea diverged sharply. Kim Il-sung's command economy and the Juche system soon proved to be a disaster. Detailed statistics are not available from North Korea, which is a secretive state, to say the least. Nonetheless, available evidence confirms what we know from the all-too-often recurring famines. Not only did industrial production fail to take off, but North Korea, in fact, experienced a collapse in agricultural productivity. Lack of private property meant that few people had incentives to invest or to exert effort to increase or even maintain productivity. The stifling, repressive regime was inimical to innovation and the adoption of new technologies. But Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and their cronies had no intention of reforming the system or introducing private property, markets, private contracts, or changing economic and political institutions. North Korea continues to stagnate economically. Meanwhile, in the South, economic institutions encouraged investment and trade. South Korean politicians invested in education, achieving high rates of literacy and schooling. South Korean companies were quick to take advantage of the relatively educated population. The policies encouraging investment and industrialization, exports, and the transfer of technology. South Korea quickly became one of East Asia's miracle economies, one of the most rapidly growing nations in the world.
And this is why defund the police and soft-on-crime policies concern me. Past that crime is a problem in its own right, our cities are incredibly important to the American economy at large, and high crime makes them less productive. This is not to say that American policing is perfect, or that there aren't worthwhile criticisms to be made of certain departments. It's just to say that crime shouldn't be taken lightly, as high crime rates have such far-reaching implications beyond causing suffering in those immediate areas. Of course, we should not be too deferential to government authorities, and we should definitely see that they do not exceed their authority, as that's not only problematic in its own rights, but governments too can violate property rights. Globally, I would argue that governments probably do more to jeopardize property rights than do private criminals. That's just a guess, though. And unfortunately, we've seen this happen at scale in the United States during the New Deal era. A few months ago, someone sent me a clip of my friends Adam and Sitch talking about FDR's economic policies.
Yes, the bombing of Europe and World War II and all stuff that allowed America to make tons of money, yes. But what channels the flow of where that money went? And that was the left-wing economic policies of FDR and all those stuff that people on the right don't want to talk about.
This was disappointing to say the least. Adam and Sitch are smart guys, but this is wrong in so many ways. Most importantly, for the purposes of this video, we'll see that the Roosevelt administration, through New Deal policies, seriously undermined property rights, which discouraged investment, which prevented actual economic growth from taking place until after World War II. If you look at this chart from the book Depression, War, and Cold War by economist Robert Higgs, you'll see a table comparing government spending to gross private investment. That is, the cumulative amount of private dollars being spent toward development in the economy. The thing that probably catches the eye most here is the government's spending spikes when the US was in the war. No surprise about that. But a more subtle detail of the chart is that gross private investment never hit pre-Great Depression levels until after the war was over, in 1948. Surely, this warrants an explanation. The explanation that Higgs offers, which seems persuasive to me, is that of regime uncertainty. No one really knew what the government was going to do next, so people with private capital sat on it rather than put it in the economy. We take for granted the role of the government now in a post-New Deal era, but remember, much of what the government did was relatively new at the time. The only precedent was Woodrow Wilson's wartime presidency, where we did see dissidents jailed, civil liberties curtailed, and property seized. Furthermore, we know what was happening internationally. Italy was experimenting with fascism, Germany with National Socialism, and Soviet Russia with central planning, all of which undermined, if not outright destroyed, property rights. Given that many of these experiments served as inspiration for aspects of the New Deal, people were not crazy to draw ominous parallels. As Higgs writes, Roosevelt, we now know, never became a dictator along the lines of his contemporaries Stalin, Mussolini, and Hitler. The New Dealers were no brown shirts, but what seems obvious to us in retrospect had quite a different appearance to many contemporaries. And while there were no brown shirts in the New Deal, it's not like bullying those who strayed from the orthodoxy was absent from the equation. Arguably, the most far-reaching aspect of the New Deal was the National Industrial Recovery Act, which, passed in 1933, established the National Recovery Administration. This new bureaucracy organized the economy along industry lines, pushing competing businesses into government-mandated cartels, which had to operate under codes of transaction, price fixing, and labor practices, all under the auspices of reducing waste in the economy writ large. In 1982, Time magazine estimated that the NRA directly covered about 2 million employers and 22 million workers. Unfortunately for the New Dealers, even though the NRA was staffed with a massive, well-funded bureaucracy, so many regulations on so much of the economy proved hard to enforce. As a means of seeing through the mandates, the NRA enlisted their own form of law enforcement to do their dirty work. As historian John T. Flynn writes in The Roosevelt Myth, the NRA was discovering it could not enforce its rules. Black markets grew up. Only the most violent police methods could procure enforcement. In Sidney Hillman's garment industry, the Code Authority employed enforcement police. They roamed through the garment district like stormtroopers. They could enter a man's factory, send him out, line up his employees, subject them to minute interrogation, take over his books in an instant. Night work was forbidden. Flying squadrons of these private coat and suit police went through the district at night, battering down doors with axes, looking for men who were committing the crime of sewing together a pair of pants at night. But without these harsh methods, many code authorities said there could be no compliance because the public was not back of it. Again, none of this was at the scale of Nazi Germany or fascist Italy, but it was enough to alarm private citizens not to make investments in the economy, fearing that the government would all but guarantee that they wouldn't get a return on investment. This is only scratching the surface. Virtually every aspect of the economy instilled fear in investors. As Lamont DuPont II, of the DuPont family, who was one of the leading businessmen and investors at the time, said in 1937, "Uncertainty rules the tax situation, the monetary situation, and practically every legal condition under which industry must operate. Are taxes going higher, lower, or stay where they are? We don't know. Is labor to be union or non-union? Are we to have inflation or deflation? More government spending or less? Are new restrictions to be placed on capital, new limits on profits? It is impossible to even guess at the answers." DuPont was not a one-off either. The cumulative effect of the New Deal policies resulted in an alienation from private investment, which is the real spur of economic growth. To quote Higgs one last time, the insufficiency of private investment from 1935 through 1940 reflected a pervasive uncertainty among investors about the security of their property rights in their capital and its prospective returns. This uncertainty arose, especially though not exclusively, from the character of the actions of the federal government and the nature of the Roosevelt administration during the so-called New Deal from 1935 to 1940. Whether it's the Korean Peninsula, Chicago, or the United States writ large, Property rights are essential for private investment in the economy. Even under the best of conditions, there is risk in business investments. But without secure property rights, there's basically no risk at all. It's all but guaranteed that you're not going to get a return on investment. Secure property rights requires a role for the government, but as we've seen, the government can overreach and violate these rights itself. The New Deal did not protect the institutions that create wealth. It nearly destroyed them.